and welcome to this episode of the Children's History video podcast. We're going to learn lots about the past and how it shaped our lives today. This is part 3 of the series into significant queens, and here are our 2 questions. Who were they? And should we remember them? Today's episode focuses on another queen from history, who I'm sure many of you won't have heard of, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians. We have the same 3 questions as the previous episodes on Boudica and Cartimandua to make comparing them a simpler task. Let's get started with some time travel. Let's take a look at our timeline. Here it is. You'll notice the scale is in 200 years once again, so each of our blocks represents a period of time of 200 years. Next to appear is our blue arrow. That reminds us that history extends far further into the past than this timeline shows. Where are we in history? We're here, that's now. Let's start working our way backwards. The First World War ended about just over 100 years ago, and we remember that and mark that on November the 11th each year. But we need to travel much further back in time to look at the life of Ethelfled. Let's keep going. This rectangle represents the Anglo-Saxon period, but we've learned about some others that came before it. Here is prehistory. That's the 3 Stone Ages, Bronze Age and Iron Age. Boudica and Cartimandua were both Celtic queens of Britain. They were part of the Iron Age of Britain. Why did that end? Well, the red box that's just appeared represents the Roman invasion and conquest. It overlaps with the Iron Age because the Romans tried to invade and conquer through Julius Caesar 100 years before they were eventually successful. There's one more timeline that we need to add to understand the life of Ethelfled. Here it is. The purple box represents the Vikings. You'll notice that the 2 timelines run alongside each other. We call this concurrence. The Saxon-Viking conflict is part of both the Saxon and Viking timeline. Where does Ethelfled fit? Her life is represented by the black box that's just appeared. So, she was alive during the conflict. And do you know the image I showed you on the previous page? Well, that was created here. Quite a few hundred years after she died. I think that tells us something about if she was significant, doesn't it? During this period, Britain was a very different place. Initially, the Vikings had arrived to raid holy sites such as Lindisfarne and steal its wealth. However, from 865 AD, they began to arrive and see Britain as a place to settle. This meant larger armies started to arrive. They were able to conquer large areas of the country, including the capital of Northumbria and consistently significant city through history, York. You can see that marked on the map. Alfred, King of Wessex, was forced to hide in the marshes of Athelney after being driven back by the invaders. You can see from the map the red area shows how much land the Saxons had lost. But after winning the Battle of Edington, a treaty was signed which created 2 kingdoms under Saxon or Viking influence. Where did she reign over? Lord Ethelred of the Mercians was chosen to lead Mercia. He accepted Alfred as overlord and was later married to Alfred the Great's daughter, Ethelfled. This sealed Alfred's control over Mercia. Mercia had lost land to the Vikings, and it was much larger before the invasion. Let's take a look at her life and reign on a new timeline. Let's take a look at her life and reign on a new timeline. You'll notice that the scale has changed. On the previous timeline, it had a scale of 200 years for each block, and now we've zoomed in so that each of the blocks represents 5 years. We've got our 2 arrows to represent time existing before it and continuing to run after it. Around 870 AD, Ethelfled was born. She was daughter to Alfred of Wessex, who would later come to be called Alfred the Great. Around 879 AD, Ethelred becomes Lord of the Mercians and accepts Alfred as overlord. In 886, the bond between Mercia and Wessex was enhanced by the marriage of Ethelfled and Ethelred. Now this was quite common in the past because marrying people was a good way to seal a political alliance. It was followed by a period of relative peace. When we say relative peace, there was still some conflict, but by the standard of the time, there was a peace. 900 AD, Ethelred and Ethelfled fortified the town of Worcester as a burh. A burh is a fortified town, and Alfred had been doing this in Essex as well. These made kingdoms harder to conquer and therefore easier to defend. In 911 AD, Ethelfled becomes Lady of the Mercians. That means she was in charge. This was almost unheard of in Wessex, but it had happened before in Mercia. She continued to increase the number of burhs to help protect the kingdom. The purple block represents the time period in which that was happening. Ethelfled was a good military commander, and towards the end of her reign she regained territory from the Vikings, which was known as the Five Boroughs, beginning with Derby. It was the first to fall to the English. Leicester surrendered without a fight, and the Viking leaders of York offered her their loyalty. But sadly she died in 918 before she could take advantage of the offer. How is she remembered? Well, she was remembered at the time in different ways. The West Saxon version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle remembers her just as King Edward's sister. Not very important, eh? On the Mercian Register, though, she was Lady, which describes her role and achievements more thoroughly. Is she remembered? A little bit. Should more people remember her? Well, given her role for the Saxons, defending and then reclaiming their lands from the Vikings, I certainly think so. Here you can see a couple of statues. Tamworth remembers Ethelfled for those reasons, for fortifying the town and helping to defeat the Vikings. Let's take a look at our key questions. Who were they? Well, we know Ethelfled was a Saxon queen who helped defeat the Vikings. That's a tick. Should we remember her? I certainly think so, and hope you would agree. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope to hear from you again soon. Bye.